I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be on the stage with Patricia and Polly, and a big shout out to the Right to Water, Right to Change people here in the audience and across the country. You may not believe this, and I know you haven't had the kind of media here in Ireland that you should have had, but you are famous across the world. You are water warriors, and we appreciate you very deeply, and we have spread your word, and we've written blogs and Facebooks and op-eds about you. We put out press releases about you may not even know about. So you are very, very important to the global water justice movement, and I'm just really thrilled to be here to be part of this. I just want to do three things tonight. One is convince you that CETA is just as important as TTIP and why. And the second is to tell you a little bit what Canada has lived through under a similar regime for 21 years. And the third thing I want to do is then talk to you about what this means to water, that specific and particular fight. CETA, you've heard from these brilliant analyses from all three previous speakers. CETA, very similar to TTIP in that it makes it very difficult to protect local economies, local job creation, and control of local spending and so on. We had something called the Green Energy Act in Ontario, the province I live in, where they gave money subsidies for alternative energy to fossil fuels and to promote local economic development, so local companies, local hiring, and so on. Sounds like a win-win, wouldn't you think? And we were challenged not only through NAFTA, but the North American Free Trade Agreement, but through the WTO, and are no longer allowed to have the Clean Energy Act. So this is the kind of thing that they're talking about at a more local level, which previous trade agreements have not tended to do. And CETA, like TTIP, as you've heard here, has this whole process of regulatory cooperation or convergence, where basically the corporate sector, the corporate lobby groups now have a say in establishing standards right across the board. And you need to be very worried about this as people who live in Europe and the UK with the standards that you're going to be dealing with coming from North America. From my country, Canada, they've been slower to be slashed, but they've been slashed, and they've been slashed in the United States for a long time. But the process begins a process to harmonize. And let me tell you, these corporations don't want to bump into different standards as they go across countries, and they sure don't want higher standards. They're looking for the lowest possible denominator. But the most important thing that I want to say to you about CETA is that it does, as well as ISDS, or as TTIP, include an investor state ISDS clause. And it's very important for you to know that if the movement against TTIP is successful in Europe, and it may be, I have great hope that this thing is winnable. I've been on the losing end of campaigns, and I've been on the winning end of campaigns, and this one feels like one that we can win. If you do manage to either stop TTIP or to substantially change it, maybe drop ISDS altogether, but you don't stop CETA, CETA will be the route through which American corporations will do exactly what they would have done under TTIP, because Canada is a branch plan economy, and all an American company has to do is use its existing subsidiary, and all of the American oil companies are already operating in our tar sands, for instance, or Monsanto, all of the big agribusiness companies, Pfizer, all of the big American drug companies are all operating in Canada. All they would have to do is just use the investor state provision of CETA, because CETA is closed. It's not ratified yet, but it's closed. And by the way, Patricia, it does not have to go to the provinces. It doesn't even have to pass our parliament. That's how bad it is in our country. But we have CETA is the negotiation itself is closed, which basically means you are stuck with the old, bad, worst ISDS. So it's very important that when you're working and very important what Polly says, that we think larger than one agreement. When you talk about TTIP, please, you must think CETA, because you're not going to win one if you don't win both. And what we're asking is that we demand that the members of the European Parliament and the individual MPs from, obviously, or the individual countries do an analysis and an assessment of CETA, a full assessment and its impact on human rights and labor and democracy and the environment and safety standards and so on, while it buys us time to build the resistance that I know is building. And when you hear what's in these agreements, it's really pretty terrible. And by the way, it isn't just American companies you have to worry about coming through CETA. Canada has the worst mining companies in the world. 75% of all mines in the world are headquartered in Canada. And an industry document, a leaked industry report, said that Canadian mining companies have by far and away the worst environmental and human rights standards in the world, and the worst reputation in the world. So our mining companies are here already operating in Romania and Greece, and they are eager to use CETA, eager to use these trade agreements to challenge any opposition to their existence or expansion. So it isn't even just a fear of American corporations. It's been really hard to get Canadians interested in CETA. We have a deal with the United States, everybody goes crazy, and everybody has an opinion, but it's Europe. And in Canada, people think, oh, Europe's cool, they have these great standards, and they're kind of like us. And similarly in Europe and here all right across the continent, it's been very hard to get people interested in CETA, partly because Canada's smaller and we're not as big a threat, but also because, again, there's this notion that we're a kinder, gentler United States, right, and it doesn't matter. But I think that doesn't understand the austerity programs that are happening here, both here and in Canada, the assault on the poor, the assault on laws and regulations for working people, the assault on the environment. We've been ratcheting down on both sides of the border, and it's going to be the lowest denominator that gets locked in. So that's my first plea to you, is please, please, please learn more about CETA. Put CETA in the same language when you're as TTIP when you're speaking. Secondly, I just want to tell you a little bit about what Canada's experienced. We've actually lived with free trade for 26 years. We were signed the first real big free trade agreement in the world called Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and that was precedent to the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has now been in place for 21 years. The North American Free Trade Agreement was the first time that a so-called developed country signed an investor-state agreement. It's the first time this ISDS was included in countries from the global north. It was because Mexico was joining the deal and they didn't trust that Mexico wouldn't nationalize their mines or whatever. But it is the precedent, and then since then there have been over 3,200 bilateral investment agreements that include this right of corporations to sue. And it's really interesting. I met early on in the CETA talks with ambassadors from all of the European Union countries to Canada. They asked me to come in and speak because I'd written an op-ed piece saying that I didn't like this thing called CETA. We were going to fight it, and they wanted to know why. And when we talked, I realized that they didn't understand investor-state. They thought investor-state just means that you're giving the corporations from the other country, the other trade agreement country, the same rights that your domestic companies have. They didn't understand that they get superior rights. You bring in a law, everybody has to obey it, but foreign investors have the right to claim compensation that your own domestic companies do not. They didn't understand it then, and I'm not sure most of them understand it now. So we've been living with this, and let me tell you, Canada's gone through a profound change in the NAFTA years. Not just NAFTA, it's NAFTA, privatization, deregulation, and so on, the whole package. But we've gone from looking like a big egg with a big middle class to looking like a pear with fewer and fewer people holding power at the top and more and more of us falling out at the bottom. And we've become a very precarious workforce. Working people in Canada are making about the same amount of money given the increase in the inflation of living, but in the cost of living. But we were earning about what we were earning in the 1980s when NAFTA came into effect. But we've also lived with this ISDS, and we are now the most sued so-called developed country in the world because of NAFTA. We've had 35 challenges from American corporations to our laws. We've already paid out 1.25 million euros in penalties to these American corporations, and there are currently 4.75 billion euros worth of challenges against us, which is just absolutely amazing. Now that doesn't include all the money that is spent defending these cases, whether you win them or lose them. They're very, very expensive. These lawyers are high-priced. They drag out these processes as long as they possibly can because, of course, the longer they go, the more money they make. And we have lost a whole bunch of cases that are connected to environmental rules. And this is really important for those of you concerned about fracking or water or climate change or anything else to do with the environment. 2/3 of all of the claims are around the environment. Quebec has a moratorium on fracking, and I know this is a huge issue here in Ireland. A company called Lone Pine has launched a 250 million, I think that in euros, about 1.75 million euro, a challenge against Canada. It has to be against the federal government, even if another level of government does this, because it's the federal government that signs the agreement. But Lone Pine is a Canadian company. So Lone Pine set up a subsidiary in the United States, and they're suing Canada through their American subsidiary. So that's how these companies do it. They just country hop. There's another one and this is very important for you in Ireland, because you would get North American fracking companies said here, fracking is allowed, and then you sign CETA or ISDS, you're going to be challenged absolutely by these companies that would have the right to say, this is the state of investment when we entered. Just to agree so much with Patricia about it doesn't matter what the law is. Early on, the very, very first NAFTA case was won by a company called S.D. Myers. Ethel Corporation. Ethel Corporation makes a product that's banned here, and it's an additive called MMT. It's an additive to gasoline, and so we banned the cross-border trade because it's an American company, and they sued, and they won, and we paid them a whole bunch of money. But their lawyer went on television. His name was Barry Appleton. He went on national television, and they said to him, "Well, I don't understand this investor state. How could this be that we have to pay a corporation?" He said, "Let me be very clear with you. You could be putting liquid plutonium in children's cereal. If that was legal when the company that puts the plutonium in their cereal was first invested, they'd have to obey it if you had said to stop doing it. But you have to pay the money to continue to do that." And the company fired him for saying that on television because it was true, but he wasn't supposed to say that on television, right? We had another lost a case where we banned the export of PCB toxic waste across the border. Here's one that's very important for you to know about, because this goes beyond just the regulation, and this goes into the ownership of water. There's a company called Attac Ireland. It was an American pulp and paper company that operated in Newfoundland, which is our easternmost island province, and they created jobs for decades. They went bankrupt, as these companies do a few years ago. They went away and declared whatever, and then came back even richer than ever. But they did leave voluntarily. Nobody kicked them out of Newfoundland. They left the jobs, and they left pensions unpaid. And then they turned around and they said, we would like to be paid the money for the water rights we left behind. And the provincial premier said he could think of a few places they could put that little thought. So they went and launched an NAFTA challenge, North American Free Trade Agreement challenge, and our then Prime Minister, instead of fighting for Newfoundland and fighting for the water, turned around and said, basically, here's $130 million for your trouble. So now we have a precedent where a corporation from one country using ISDS can actually claim to own the resource it used in another country. And think of the precedent for that. If you think of, say, all of the foreign investors in Africa and that land grab 3 times the size of Great Britain, what if they claim not only the right to be there because they have contracts, but that they own the soil, that they own the land, that they own the water? So this is a really dangerous development. And the thing with CETA is very, very important. Both CETA and NAFTA and TTIP lock in privatization. This point was made, and I want to make it again. We've had this experiment around the world with water privatization for, they're almost 30 years now. The World Bank first started promoting it just after Margaret Thatcher sold off the entire water concession in England in 1987. The World Bank started saying to poor countries, if you want money for water services, you're going to have to take Veolia or Suez or one of the big European companies, and we will do the deal in secret. It's got nothing to do with you, and then it's a euphemism for profit. And I believe that this is probably done in anticipation of Ireland's moving to a fully privatized system. Under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the government say, well, we've protected drinking water, we listed drinking water under this negative list, but they only listed it in what they call its natural state. Almost all water, drinking water and sanitation, water for food production, water for energy production, and so on, involves water extracted from the environment, and one can therefore clearly argue that it is, in that case, a good and a product. And here's what the agreement says: where a party permits the commercial use of a water source, it has to do so in accord with the full tenets of the deal. In other words, you know, if a company says, well, that water is for a commercial purpose, no matter how you say it was originally coming from a natural source, they can argue that it's got to be established it's got to be ruled under the rules of these agreements. As well, under regulatory cooperation, the rules allow private water corporations to be consulted on laws that affect trade and investment that interfere in any way with their bottom line, and they can actually say that proviso, it goes against our interests as we understood them. So say Ireland takes a position in the future, and this is something that Right to Water is calling for a constitutional amendment to guarantee that water is a human right and a public trust, a public service, never to be privatized. If they do that, they could absolutely be challenged under both CETA and TTIP, and potentially under the TISA that's coming down the pike. So this is very important that we understand the work that we're all doing in different areas around water protection, around fracking, around labor rights and human rights and so on, will all be harder to maintain. I'm not saying it won't be worth doing anymore, but it gets harder and harder when these trade agreements come along. And I want to give you a story of one community and tell you how these trade agreements, from NAFTA to TTIP, which isn't in place yet, but I want to show you where it will go with TTIP and what it means. We keep thinking of water poverty and water desperation as being in the global south. We think about people not having running water and sanitation to be a southern problem, crisis, and it is absolutely. 2.5 billion people don't have access to sanitation, about 1 billion people defecate in the open in our world, and close to 1 billion people have no access to clean water. And as the water crisis deepens, and it is deepening, that crisis, the human crisis, is going to get even worse. I mean, let me tell you, we are a planet running out of clean water. And I don't have time tonight to go into the details, but we know that we are diverting our rivers to death. Most major rivers no longer reach the ocean. We're pulling up groundwater way faster than it can be replenished by natural means and by nature. NASA has a new satellite technology that's been able to identify the big aquifers, and they say there are 37 major aquifers, and that we've seriously already harmed 21 of them. Now, if you stop and realize that we've only had the borewell technology to do that, to access that water in the last 60 to 70 years, you can imagine how fast a thirsty world is pulling up water that belongs to future generations. Basically, the demand is going straight up and the supply is going straight down, and that's what we're facing, and that's why it matters, not only that we protect our water, that we see that water has rights, but that we establish that it is a human right and it is a public trust, and it must not be allowed to be put into corporate hands, because then it becomes a commodity to be controlled, put on the open market, and for the privilege of those who can afford it and who can afford to buy it. So the story is about Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan was one of the wealthiest cities in the United States at one point, and the auto hub and the heart of the auto industry. And during and you can see this, if you ever go to Windsor, the first few blocks, you'll see these fabulous old buildings. They're just gorgeous. You can tell there was a lot of money there. But they started allowing, the US government started allowing foreign companies, auto companies, to come in and operate for the first time in the late 1970s and 1980s. But they chose to move down to southern states where the wages were lower. So they started bleeding a bit during that. But in 1994, when NAFTA came into effect, basically they allowed the they moved right south past the southern states right down to Mexico, and you can see, you could absolutely watch the auto jobs draining from my country, Canada, from northern United States to southern United States, and then on down to Mexico. When NAFTA was first signed, there were 300,000 auto jobs in the Detroit area. Now there are fewer than 130,000. So what happened is, in a very, very short period of time, over 1 million people left inner city Detroit, mostly white people, mostly people with money, and they moved out to the wealthy suburbs, and what they left behind were African American, it's 85 to 90% African American, poor, unemployed people who could not sell their houses and move, right, because nobody would buy them. And so they didn't have the tax base to bring in the money they needed to continue to deliver water. So they doubled and then they tripled the rate of water. And now they pay the highest rate of water in the United States for water and wastewater. So people couldn't pay, nor did the big businesses, by the way. So 2 years ago, the governor of Michigan declared the city of Detroit to be bankrupt. They brought in a manager. The mayor and the city council had no power anymore. They brought in a general manager, and he set out the process of privatizing their water system, which is the next stage of what's coming. And he basically started privatizing parts of it and said it has to be full cost recovery. So they started cutoffs, serious cutoffs. They announced two years ago this spring, two Marches ago, that they would cut off 3,000 families a week. Now try to imagine, 6 o'clock in the morning, you're sound asleep, and this noise arrives on your block, and this private company, a lot of them really tough guys, get out and they just start going down your block and turning the water off to absolutely everybody. Doesn't matter whether you have kids, doesn't matter whether you have elderly or sick people in your family, the water gets turned off, and the process to get it turned on again is a nightmare. You are without flushing toilets, you're without showers, you're without water to cook with, you're without anything. This isn't the global south, or should I say it is the global south, now in the global north, and is coming to a community near you if we continue this, by the way. And so thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people had their water cut off. I got involved, went to Detroit, pulled in the United Nations. We got 3 special rapporteurs, 3 experts on water, one on food and one on housing, to come to Detroit and do a tour and an examination, and they said this is a complete violation of the human right to water and sanitation, which was adopted by the United Nations on July 28, 2010. This is a violation. The United States gives money to poor countries for water, for people who don't have running water, and here it is right in their country. By the way, Detroit's not the only city. So I tell you this because now the next step is for them to move to water privatization, and if they do that before a TTIP is signed, or before the Trans-Pacific Partnership is in full place, then the corporations from Europe, Suez and Veolia, which are the parent companies of all the American water service companies, can just say, you can never go back. So in 10 or 15 or 20 years, if a renewed city of Detroit and people get their act together and come back and say we want our water back in public hands, I mean, for goodness sake, we live on the Great Lakes. What is this, that we can't have water coming out of our taps? And by the way, the social services follows them around, and in houses that are without water for over a week, the children have to be removed. So it's just, it's a nightmare, and it's a nightmare on our doorstep. And you may or may not know that through austerity in Europe, thousands of people have had their water cut off in Greece, in Spain, in Hungary, in Italy. There have been huge water cutoffs. It's not just, Detroit's perhaps the most spectacular. So NAFTA, which started the process, gets finished and locks in water privatization. And you can bet these water companies are just salivating at getting access to, it'll be a fire sale price water company right on the Great Lakes in a world that is growing thirstier and thirstier. So we are water stewards. We are the people there's nobody going to do it but us. There's just us. Our politicians, they drank the Kool-Aid. They all just, I think of it as, they think there's only one train and you have to be on that train. And if they're little bit more left or progressive or liberal, whatever, they hope that they can mitigate against the worst of this, but there's only one train, and I keep saying, no, there isn't. There's a whole other vision. There's just a completely whole other vision of how we could do it and how we can live. But it's going to be, our movement is going to be a movement of people, of activists, working with labor. It's really important that labor and civil society come together. And I just want to pledge my deep support from Canada. I chair an organization called the Council of Canadians. We're a national social and environmental justice movement. We exist to serve our members, not vice versa. We have 70-some activist chapters across the country, and they are awesome. And we fight. We fight for justice, and we're going to continue to fight for justice. And I personally think there is no greater gift than to be alive at this time with these challenges that we just must accept. And I just do this in a sign of solidarity with you, and just love being here. Thank you so much.